Hey guys, in this lesson, I will cover AWS CodePipeline. So what is CodePipeline? CodePipeline is a service that we can use for creating CI/CD pipelines. It's a continuous delivery service, so when we're using continuous integration and continuous delivery or continuous deployment, this is the service that helps us to bring everything together and create the automated pipeline. So we have an AWS CodePipeline. Within the pipeline, we create stages. For example, a stage could be a source code stage for our GitHub repository. It could be a build and test stage for building and testing our code, and that might use AWS CodeBuild as the service that we integrate. But it doesn't have to be CodeBuild. It doesn't have to be AWS. There are other options as well. And then for the deployment, here we're using code deploy. So this is to deploy the code out to the actual application. So we have a code pipeline. Within that, we can create our build, test, and deploy phases for whatever release process it is that we want to implement. So when there are code changes, how do we want those to go through the various stages of being synchronized into a repository, pushed through to a build and test service and tested, and then ultimately out to the end application, perhaps with some manual approval stages or some other kind of approval actually happening as part of the pipeline as well. So here we've got GitHub as the source code, code build for doing the build and test. Then we've got a manual approval step, and then code deploy to push through to the running application. So the developer commits the code to the repository. The code is then pushed through to code build. So code pipeline is causing that event trigger to happen. Then it goes to manual approval. So now you could actually have someone checking and approving it at the right time after it's actually passed the relevant human checks, as well as the automated checks that happen through the code build. So we have an approver approving the updates, and then they're pushed through to code deploy, which actually deploys the actual updates to the code out to the application. So what are the possible integrations? There's lots of different AWS and third-party integrations for the various different stages in a pipeline. For instance, for the source stage, we can have our code in S3, in ECR, in GitHub, in GitLab, in Bitbucket, and more. For the build stage, we can actually run shell commands, or we can use code build, ECR, or Jenkins. For test, code build, device farm, Jenkins, Ghost Inspector UI testing, Micro Focus, Storm Runner load, run scope API monitoring, and this list changes from time to time, so it may not be accurate. When we get into the actual console, you'll be able to see what the current integrations are at the time of you going in and actually building your pipeline. For the deployment stage, we've got a variety of options as well: app config, CloudFormation, code deploy, ECS, Elastic Beanstalk, AWS Service Catalog, S3, and Alexa Skills Kit at this particular time. So let's cover some of the concepts. We have pipelines. This is a workflow that describes how software changes go through the release process. Each pipeline is made up of a series of stages. There are two types of pipeline you can create: a V1 type pipeline, which has a JSON structure and contains standard pipeline stage and action level parameters, and then the V2 type, which has some additional options for release safety and trigger configuration. We have artifacts as well, so these are the files or changes that are going to be worked on by the actions and stages in the pipeline. Each pipeline stage can create its own artifacts. They are passed and stored in S3 and then passed on to the next stage. Examples might include your source code, your built applications, dependencies, definition files, templates, and more. Then we have stages. So pipelines are broken up into stages. For example, source, that is our source code repository where our code changes are committed. Then we have build, where our changes are built. So that can mean, for example, compiling our code, and it can also mean running some tests on the code as well. Then we've got stages, so the code is deployed and tested in a staging environment, for example. And we might add that stage before we go through to deployment to actual productions. So we can build our own customized pipelines depending on our specific requirements. Each stage can have sequential actions and or parallel actions. And for example, our stages would be source, build, test, deploy, load test, etc. We can also define manual approval at any stage. Another concept is actions. Stages contain at least one action, such as a source action from a code change, where a developer is committing a change of the code to the code base, or an action for deploying the actual application to instances. Actions can affect artifacts and will have their own artifacts as either input or output or both. Transitions are the progression from one stage to another inside of a pipeline. Pipeline executions are the actual execution of a set of changes released by a pipeline, and each has its own unique ID. So here, for example, an execution would be where the developer has committed the code, pushed it through to the repository. That change has then triggered the pipeline. So that will create an execution of the pipeline. That execution may be that the entire pipeline is used, so the code ends up being deployed right out to the actual application. Or maybe it fails, or maybe it results in the developer getting some feedback that they need to make some changes because the build and test phase didn't actually complete successfully. All of those would still be executions. So an execution corresponds to a set of changes such as a merged commit or a manual release of the latest commit. Two executions can release the same set of changes at different times as well. So to summarize, CodePipeline gives us a way to integrate various different AWS and third-party services that represent the different stages of the release process and create the relevant automations between one stage and another. And here's just an example of some of the options that we've discussed earlier in terms of the different AWS and third-party services that you can integrate into different stages. So in this lesson, we're going to create a pipeline using AWS CodePipeline and an application running on AWS Elastic Beanstalk. So the lab will look a bit like this. We've got GitHub, and that's going to be included in a code pipeline as the source stage. And the deployment stage here is actually using Elastic Beanstalk. So Beanstalk can be its own deployment provider within a code pipeline. Now, our developer can actually push code to the GitHub repository, and the code pipeline will then trigger the update via Elastic Beanstalk to make updates to the actual live application. So let's head over and build this out. The first thing we'll do is head over to Elastic Beanstalk, and we're going to create an environment. It's going to be a web server environment, and I'm going to call this DevOps Labs. Scroll down. It's going to create the environment name for me. For platform type, we'll leave Manage Platform. We'll choose Node.js. Scroll down. We'll use the sample application for now. Click on Next. There's quite a lot of pages in the new wizard. Depending on whether you've used Beanstalk before, it may or may not have the service role. If you've not used Beanstalk before, you might have to create a new service role. If you do that, it's going to create one of this name. If you have used Beanstalk before, you've probably already been through that process, so you can use the existing service role. Now, you are required to do a few things here that I don't even need to do. One is to add a key pair, so I'm just going to add anyone. I also need to add an instance profile, even though I don't want to supply permissions to any other services, but it will error if we don't, so I'll just choose one of the instance profiles I already have in my account. Click on Next. I'm going to choose the default VPC. I can choose one or two subnets within my default VPC. Don't need a database. Click on Next. Leave the defaults. Don't need to have any special monitoring. So let me just see, is there any changes I want to make here? I can leave these defaults, in fact. I'll just choose my web access security group. Scroll down. Click on Next. Basic monitoring is fine. Turn off managed updates. We don't need any of this at the moment. I'm just trying to make sure that it doesn't error, because the new Beanstalk wizard, it's not really new, but it's been around for a while, but it's kind of, it has a lot of settings which it doesn't really tell you, but that are actually prerequisites for it to actually complete correctly. So hopefully that will do the job. Let's submit. And it is launching the environment. So while that's launching, I'm going to head over to CodePipeline. So we'll get ahead of ourselves a little bit here. And under Settings and Connections, we're going to use a repository in GitHub. Now, in order to be able to do that, you need to create a connection. You only actually need one. I've actually done this a couple of times, so I can delete that one. And what you need to do here is just click on Create Connection, choose GitHub, give it a name, and then click on Connect to GitHub. When you do that, it should require authentication. Because I'm already authenticated, it might not show that right now. Okay, so I actually don't need to set any settings there. Literally just click on Connect, and it's going to create that connection. Now again, for you, that's probably going to require you to log into GitHub. I'm actually already logged in here. Plus, I've done this before. So I only need one of these, so I'll just delete the extra one. So that means we now have authentication so that we can set our repository as the source stage. So I'm going to click on New in GitHub, and I'm going to create a repo called DevOps-Labs, public repository, and then click on Create. So that's done. Let's just come back and check our Beanstalk environment. Still being created. Let's click on the option here just to see it's not ready quite yet. So while that's happening, what I'm going to do is open up AWS CloudShell, and we're going to use CloudShell for the Git client. So what I can do is come back to the repository, click on this option to copy the clone link. Let's come to CloudShell, clear my screen, and I'm going to git clone, paste in that URL, and now we've got our repository. So I should now be able to change into DevOps Labs. There we go. Let's come back to our environment here. It says it's launched. Let's check it out. There we go. It is launched. And it's launched, and you can see that it's got this sort of splash screen that they provide, the default page, green on the left. And I note that because we're going to change that shortly as part of an update. So what I want to do now is come back to CodePipeline. We're going to click on Pipelines here on the left-hand side. Click on Create Pipeline. Choose Build Custom Pipeline. I'm going to give it the name DevOps-Labs. Allow it to create a new service role. Click on Next. For source provider, I'm going to choose GitHub via GitHub app. I should now be able to select my connection that I created a little bit earlier on. And now I'm going to go and find the DevOps Labs here. For default branch, we're going to enter main. And then we're going to click on next. We don't have a build stage at this time. We're not going to use a testing stage. So now we just skip through until we see deploy. And what we can do here is select Beanstalk. Input artifact should be source artifact. Application name should be DevOps Labs, and environment name is DevOps Labs env. Click on Next. Let's scroll all the way down, and we're going to create our pipeline. So the pipeline is created, and we're going to see it's initially going to kick off the pipeline. So it's triggering it based on the source stage. So it's going to check with GitHub, is there any code there to deploy? And I'm expecting that to error. And that's because there isn't any code to deploy at this stage. So that's fine. No problem at all. We're going to add the code in right now. So what you want to do is head over to CloudShell. In AWS CloudShell, I'm going to click on Actions, Upload File, and from the AWS Developer Tools of the course download, select node.jsblue.zip. I've got the file. Let's unzip, and that's created a directory. And now I'm going to copy all of the files from node.jsblue to the DevOps folder. Let's change back to DevOps. Just clear my screen, run ls, and now we have these various different files, including an index.html. Now the difference with this index.html is that it actually specifies that the color on the left-hand side of the index.html is blue rather than green. Okay, so these are the changes. Now I can run git add -A, git commit -m, added updated index.html and other files as well, but that's okay. And then we're going to push this change up to the repository. Enter my username and then enter my password. And that's pushed the change. So let's go back now and watch what happens here in our pipeline. And you can see straight away we have in progress for our source stage. So the change which we've just pushed up to our GitHub repository here, we can see all these different files, has triggered the pipeline. And now it's triggered through to the deploy phase where Beanstalk is going to be making this change. So if we head back over to Beanstalk here, and we can see that the environment is now being updated. So it won't be instant, but fairly quickly we're going to find that this changes to blue. So you can watch the progress here, and really within a minute or two, I suspect it should be ready. So the environment update was successful. Let's now come back and refresh the screen here. And sure enough, our background has changed to blue. So that's an example of pushing code via GitHub through a code pipeline with the deployment provider being Beanstalk, and it's actually updating our environment and making that change.